I never talked about the house at work, not because I was ashamed of it, but because it felt like the one thing in my life that was entirely mine. My grandmother had left it to me 3 years ago, a two-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street in Asheville, North Carolina, with a wide front porch and a backyard that still had her rose bushes growing along the fence. She had pulled me aside 2 weeks before she passed and told me she was leaving it specifically to me, not to my brother, not to my mother, to me. She said I was the one who visited every Sunday. She said I was the one who drove her to her appointments when her eyesight got too bad. She said she wanted to make sure I always had somewhere safe to land. I was 38 years old, working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic, renting a small apartment 20 minutes from the house. I kept the house rented to a lovely older couple named the Garcias, who paid on time every month and treated the rose bushes like they were their own. I had plans. I was going to move in within the next 2 years, once I had enough saved to do some updates. New kitchen cabinets, refinished floors, a proper coat of paint on the porch. I thought about that house the way other people think about retirement. It was my future, sitting quietly on a residential street, waiting for me. My brother was 43. He lived 40 minutes away with his wife and their 2 kids in a house they had bought at the peak of the market and had been underwater on ever since. He called me every few months, usually when something was wrong. A car repair, a credit card balance, a school tuition payment they had not planned for. I helped when I could. I said no when I had to. Our relationship was functional in the way that some sibling relationships are functional, which means we got along at holidays and did not ask too many questions the rest of the time. His wife had never liked me. She smiled at the right moments and asked about my job in a tone that made clear she found it unimpressive. She had been polite to my grandmother, but not warm, and I noticed that she stopped coming to Sunday visits entirely in the last year of my grandmother's life. I never said anything about it. Some things are not worth the argument. I was at the clinic on a Tuesday afternoon, between patients, eating a granola bar at my desk, when my phone rang. The number was local, but I did not recognize it. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked it up on the 4th ring. The woman on the other end identified herself as a paralegal at a real estate law firm in Asheville. She said her name was Diane Holloway. She asked if I was the owner of record for the property on Clover Hill Drive. I said yes. She said, "We've been retained in connection with the sale of that property. I'm reaching out because there are some documents that require your signature to proceed with closing." I set the granola bar down. I said, "I'm sorry, what sale?" There was a pause. A short one, but I caught it. The kind of pause that means the person on the other end is recalibrating. She said, "The sale of your property." The listing closed an accepted offer approximately 3 weeks ago. We're scheduled to close at the end of the month. I stood up from my desk. I walked to the window and looked at the parking lot outside without seeing it. I said, "I never listed that property. I never signed anything. I have no idea what you're talking about." Another pause, longer this time. She said, "Can you hold for 1 moment?" I held. I stood at that window for 4 minutes by the clock on my phone. My mind was doing something I can only describe as refusing to process, like a computer that freezes not because it lacks power, but because it has been given an instruction it cannot execute. When Diane came back on the line, her voice had changed. It was careful now, measured in the way that people sound when they have just realized they are in the middle of something much larger than a routine closing call. She said, "I think you need to come in and speak with one of our attorneys. Today, if possible." I left work an hour early. I did not tell my supervisor what was happening because I did not yet know what was happening. I drove to the law firm, which was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, and I sat across from a real estate attorney named Gerald Foss, who had the kind of face that has spent decades being professionally unreadable. He opened a folder and turned it toward me across the desk. He said, "This is the listing agreement for your property. It was signed 6 weeks ago." I looked at the signature line. My name was there. The handwriting was close. It was not mine. I said, "That is not my signature." He looked at me for a long moment. I said it again, more clearly. "That is not my signature. I did not sign that. I did not authorize a listing. I did not authorize a sale. I did not know this property was on the market until 45 minutes ago when your paralegal called me." He closed the folder slowly. He folded his hands on top of it. He said, "The listing agent of record is someone named Preston Wayland. Do you know that name?" I shook my head. He said, "The buyer's offer was accepted at $312,000. The wire is scheduled to transfer at closing, which is 11 days from today. $312,000. The house my grandmother gave me. The house I had been planning my future around. 11 days. I asked him who had initiated the listing. I asked him how a property gets listed for sale without the owner's knowledge. I asked him how a forged signature makes it through a listing agreement, through a title search, through weeks of a transaction without anyone catching it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We are going to need to pause this transaction. I would strongly advise you to contact an attorney of your own, contact the county recorder's office, and contact law enforcement today." I asked him again. I said, "Do you know who brought you this listing? Who hired your firm?" He looked at the folder. He said, "The transaction was brought to us through the listing agent, Preston Wayland." The name still meant nothing to me. I drove home in a state that I cannot accurately describe as calm because it was not calm, but it was not panic either. It was something colder than panic. It was the feeling of standing in a room you thought you knew and realizing the walls are different than you remembered. I called my brother that evening. I did not tell him what I knew. I asked him, casually, how things were going. He said fine. He said the kids were good. He said work was stressful. He asked how I was. I said fine. I said I had a long day. I listened to his voice for anything, and I heard nothing except the ordinary performance of a person having a normal Tuesday. I called my own attorney the next morning. Her name was Margaret Cho, and she had handled my grandmother's estate, so she knew the property and the title history. I walked her through everything Diane had told me and everything Gerald Foss had shown me. She was quiet while I talked. When I finished, she said, "I'm going to pull the recorder records right now while we're on the phone." I heard her typing. She said, "Okay, the deed is still in your name. The title has not transferred. The listing agreement alone cannot transfer title. But we need to move quickly because if that closing proceeds and you are not there to stop it, things get much more complicated." She filed an emergency title alert with the county that same afternoon. She sent a written notice to the law firm and to the listing agent demanding an immediate halt to the transaction. She contacted the county recorder's office and placed a flag on the property that would require her confirmation before any transfer could be recorded. Then she told me something that I had not known before that moment. She said that in North Carolina, and in many other states, a deed or title can be locked at the county level so that no transfer, no lien, no mortgage can be recorded without the owner appearing in person. She said most people do not know this option exists. She said it is free to set up in most counties. She said, "After this is resolved, we are going to do that for your property." I wrote it down. I thought about how many people own property and do not know that their name on a deed is not by itself enough to protect them. 2 days after I contacted my attorney, I got a call from the Asheville Police Department. A detective named Howard Brandt had been assigned to the case. He asked me to come in. I sat across from him in a small office and he walked me through what his preliminary investigation had found. The listing agent, Preston Wayland, had a real estate license that was current. He had submitted the listing with documents that included a forged signature on the listing agreement and a notarized authorization form that had also been falsified. The notary stamp on the authorization form came back to a notary whose license had lapsed 8 months prior. Someone had used the stamp anyway. Detective Brandt asked me if I knew anyone who might have had access to my signature. Anyone who might have documents I had signed in the past. Anyone who knew the property well enough to describe it accurately in a listing, to know the address, the square footage, the rental income. I thought about that for a long time. I said, "My brother." I said it quietly, but I said it clearly. Detective Brandt wrote it down without any visible reaction, which I found both professional and devastating. He asked me about my brother's financial situation. I told him what I knew, which was not precise but was enough to paint a picture. He asked me if my brother had ever expressed interest in the house. I thought back through 3 years of conversations. I remembered one night at Christmas, 2 years ago, when my brother had said, offhand, that grandmother had not been fair in her decision, that the property should have been split between us. I had changed the subject. His wife had watched me from across the room with an expression I had not been able to read at the time. Detective Brandt asked me if I knew the name Preston Wayland. I said no. He still meant nothing to me. Brandt turned his laptop toward me and showed me a Facebook profile photo. I looked at the face. Dark hair, mid-40s, standing in front of a lake with a fishing rod, grinning at the camera. I said, "I don't know him." Brandt said, "He's been friends with your brother on Facebook since 2019. They coached Little League together the year before last." I looked at the photo again. I said, "They planned this." Brandt said, "That is what we are investigating." I drove home that afternoon and I sat on my apartment couch for a long time without turning on any lights. The room got dark around me. I was not crying. I was doing something quieter than crying, which is absorbing the specific grief of being betrayed by someone you grew up with. someone who knew what that house meant. Someone who had watched me drive to our grandmother's house every Sunday for years and had decided that what I had built through that devotion was something he was owed. My attorney called me that evening with an update. The closing had been officially halted. The buyer had been notified that there was a title dispute and that the transaction could not proceed. The wire had not moved. She said the buyer appeared to be a legitimate third party who had no knowledge of the fraud, which meant there was going to be a complicated conversation ahead about their position, but that my ownership of the property was not in question. She also told me something that I want anyone listening to this to hear clearly. She said the buyer's real estate agent had flagged something odd during their due diligence. She said the buyer's agent had noticed that the property had long-term tenants and had asked the listing agent about the transition plan. She said Preston Wayland had provided a response that did not fully add up, but that the buyer's agent had let it go because the price was good. She said that one flag, if someone had pulled that thread a little harder, might have surfaced the fraud weeks earlier. The Garcias, my tenants, had been contacted by Preston Wayland and told that the property was being sold and that they needed to begin their move-out process. They had not called me because Wayland had told them I had authorized him to handle communications and that I was traveling for work. They were in the process of looking for a new place to live. When I called them and explained what had happened, Mr. Garcia was silent for a moment and then said, "We thought it was strange you didn't call us yourself." They had started packing boxes. I told them to unpack them. The criminal investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 3 weeks, Detective Brandt called me to tell me that my brother and Preston Wayland had both been charged. Forgery, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. Wayland faced additional charges related to misuse of his real estate license and the falsified notary documentation. My brother's wife had been interviewed, but at that point had not been charged, though Brandt indicated the investigation into her role was ongoing. My brother called me the night before his arraignment. I saw his name on my phone and I let it ring. Then I picked it up on the last ring before voicemail. He did not apologize. He said he needed me to understand that he was in a bad situation financially and that he had not thought it would go this far. He said he thought I would just get the money and it would work out. He said grandmother should have split it equally anyway. I said, "You forged my signature. You tried to steal my home." He said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "When? After the wire cleared?" He did not answer. I said, "I have to go." And I hung up. That was 6 months ago. The criminal case is still working its way through the system. Preston Wayland entered a guilty plea and is awaiting sentencing. My brother's case goes to trial in the spring. His attorney has apparently been building a case around financial duress and the argument that he intended to compensate me after the fact, which my own attorney tells me is not going to be a particularly compelling defense given the evidence. The Garcias are still in the house. They renewed their lease for another year, and they send me photos of the rose bushes every spring. My grandmother planted those roses 30 years ago, and they are still blooming, which feels like something she would have considered a form of stubbornness, and she would have approved. My attorney added a title lock to the property the week after everything resolved. It took about 40 minutes and cost nothing. No transfer, no lien, no mortgage can now be recorded against that property without me appearing in person at the county recorder's office with identification. If anyone tries to forge a document and submit it, the flag triggers an alert. It is not a perfect system, but it is one more lock on the door, and right now I want every lock I can get. There are a few things I want to say directly to anyone listening who owns property, because this is not a story that can only happen to someone else. Real estate fraud against property owners is more common than most people realize. The signatures on listing agreements and authorization forms are not always verified in the way you would assume. Title fraud, deed fraud, and unauthorized transfers do happen, and they happen often enough that there are companies and county programs built specifically to address them. If you own property, call your county recorder's office and ask about owner alert programs or title lock options. Most counties have some form of notification system that alerts you when any document is filed against your property. Set it up. It takes less than an hour, and most of the time it is free. If you own property that you do not live in, like a rental or an inherited home, you are at higher risk because there is no one on site to notice if something is wrong. If you ever receive a call like the one I received, the paralegal calling about a sale you did not initiate, do not assume it is a mistake that will sort itself out. Do not wait. Contact an attorney immediately. Contact your county recorder's office immediately. And contact law enforcement. The window to stop a fraudulent transaction before it closes is real, but it is not infinite. I think about the version of this story where I had let that call go to voicemail, where I had seen the unknown number and decided I did not have time between patients. The closing was 11 days away. The wire was scheduled. The buyers had movers lined up. For all I know, the Garcias were packing boxes. I think about how many steps that transaction had already moved through without anyone stopping it, and I understand why people say these things cannot happen. But they do happen. And the only reason it did not happen to me completely is that someone called before it was too late, and I picked up the phone. My grandmother told me the last time I saw her that the house was going to be my foundation. She used that specific word, foundation. She said a person needs something solid underneath them, something that does not move when everything else does. She squeezed my hand when she said it, and she looked at me in the way that old people sometimes look at younger people, like they are trying to pass something through the air between them before they run out of time. The house is still mine. The rose bushes are still blooming. And I finally have an appointment in 3 months to meet with a contractor about the kitchen cabinets. Some things take longer than you planned, but if you protect what is yours, you get to the other side of it. That is the part my brother did not count on.